Joining us on Newsmakers this week from the Pentagon is the Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson. Dr. Wilson was sworn in May of 2017. She oversees 685,000 Air Force active duty, Guard, Reserve, and civilian forces and manages the Air Force's annual budget. She brings to this job experience as an Air Force officer herself, was a former member of the House of Representatives, and also was part of the National Security Council earlier in her career. Thank you very much for doing our program this week.
It's very good to be with you.
Let me introduce the two reporters asking questions of Secretary Wilson. Dan Lamothe is Washington Post national security reporter, returning to Newsmakers this week. Thanks, Dan. And Bob Burns is Associated Press national security reporter, and he's also the head of the Pentagon Press Association. Nice to see you, Bob. And you're up first with questions.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Madam Secretary, the Defense Department is in a very unusual situation this year with a acting Secretary of Defense. Unclear whether the President will nominate Pat Shanahan to be the Senate-confirmed Secretary or not. And your name is often mentioned as a highly qualified candidate for that job. I'm wondering if you can tell us whether you've been approached by the White House for this, and if so, if you were asked to serve, would you do so?
Bob, thank you. I think it's humbling to have people speak of me in that way, and I serve at the pleasure of the President. My focus is on, we've got a budget that is about to roll out here in 2 weeks, a President's budget going to Capitol Hill. The President has a new proposal for a Space Force that would be underneath the Air Force, and my focus is on those things.
As a quick follow-up, could I ask you whether over these past couple of months since Jim Mattis left the job as Secretary of Defense, whether relationships between the services and the Secretary's office have changed in any way? Has management of the Pentagon changed in any way?
Well, for the service secretaries, we actually have a very good relationship among the three of us, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and our focus is on organizing, training, and equipping the force, and we cooperate very well together, and we continue on to execute that job. Just do the job, do the work.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. I wanted to ask you about Space Force. Obviously, major focus this week. The President signed his directive. I know you're going to have a leading hand in organizing that. What do you think the first several steps are, and when do you think we might see some sort of legislation moving over to Capitol Hill?
The draft legislation will go forward with the President's budget, although there's a question about the dates and timing of these things, as you can imagine, but it will be within the next couple of weeks sometime. So that piece of draft legislation is pretty much underway. Of course, we have other things that are already getting done. The stand-up of the Combatant Command for Space, which we had before 9/11. There was a U.S. Space Command. That's being stood up and doesn't require additional legislation because it's already been authorized. We have reorganized acquisition for space and stood up the Space Rapid Capabilities Office. We've cut the amount of time down to actually get on contract for satellite capabilities. And of course, there's a big part of this, Dan, as you know, that's the budget. In the fiscal year 19 President's budget, there was a significant increase in money appropriated for space capabilities, and we reprogrammed a lot in our existing budget. We were able to get the congressional support for that, and this next fiscal year 20 budget proposal that the President will put forward is also a significant increase. So the focus on first capabilities to the warfighter, organizing for war fighting, and then the legislative proposal will go forward that will include a Space Force organized underneath the United States Air Force.
In the fall, you had a memo that suggested we were looking at about $13 billion over the next 5 years. That included the Space Command, as I understood it. The proposal then doesn't quite match what we saw at this point with the White House. I assume maybe there was some discussions about what made sense initially here. How much do you think it'll cost in this initial budget request now, and what are we looking at over the next 5 years?
The paper that you refer to that we were tasked to do was actually an internal one inside the Air Force, or rather inside the Pentagon, that laid out the various different choices and components that we would have to cost out, and really looked at an entire new department and force that included acquisition and legal and finance and budgeting and personnel, so all of the things that a completely independent department would have to do. The President has given us guidance and signed that out earlier this week that said we're going to propose to establish a Space Force that has a chief of staff, and will have those components, but will not have a completely independent acquisition, legal, finance, and all of those things. So that would remain within a department of the Air Force, and we would have an undersecretary specifically for space. I currently have one undersecretary. It would expand that to two. And by doing that, the President is elevating the importance of space and the focus on space, and has really made it a kind of kitchen table conversation for the country to recognize the threat that is there in space. So the overall cost is significantly less because the President has directed components to keep the cost down.
What do you anticipate the reaction will be from the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives?
Well, we're going to begin to engage with the Congress, on both the House and the Senate, on what their priorities are. I think there is very broad agreement that space will be contested, and it's because we're so good at this. The United States is the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. And they are seeking to develop the capabilities to deny us the use of space in crisis or war. We're not going to let that happen. Now, we then have to engage with them on how they would best like to see this organized to make sure that we remain dominant in space. And so there will be discussions over the next several months after the President's proposal goes forward.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, of course there is a bit of a history of legislative proposals for creating what was once called the Space Corps. I'm wondering whether you think, and that was favored quite heavily as I recall in the House, I'm wondering what you think the sentiment is now in the Senate for this new proposal.
Bob, I think at this point it would be unwise for me to characterize it, nor do we really know. The President's proposal has not yet been transmitted to the Congress. I expect that we will have numerous discussions and possibly hearings with members of the House and the Senate, and that will take place over the next several months.
When it comes to the Space Corps, you go back to 2017, prior to the President pushing for a Space Force. Both you and Secretary Mattis at the time had concerns about it, raised issues with it. I recall a letter that you sent Congressman Michael Turner saying that if we did this, we may as well basically move for a submarine force as another option. What's happened between then and now? You've said more recently that you're in favor of it.
One of the things that presidents have the opportunity to do, Dan, is to highlight issues and make sure they move forward. They have the power of the presidency to say this is important. It's important for the country to focus on, and we are going to move forward and make sure that we are not denied the use of space in crisis or war. I'm the Secretary of the Air Force. I don't have the same kind of power of the presidency that the White House has. By bringing this forward and saying we're going to do something different, we're going to create a new force, we're going to do it in a cost-effective way, the President has made this kitchen table conversation, and he has made it a central element of what he wants to do as President of the United States. And so I think, kudos to him for bringing this to the center, to the fore, in a way that it really wasn't before.
Madam Secretary, I'd like to ask you a question about the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Next week, of course, there will be a summit between the American and North Korean leaders. I'm wondering if you think that in the context of Air Force strategic air exercises that have long history in the area, whether you think there's room to either change or reduce those exercises, Air Force strategic presence in the region, without diminishing deterrent effect.
Well, the United States Air Force and our allies in the Indo-Pacific will always be ready, and that requires training and exercises. There are times when we do training and exercises or particular flights to be part of sending a message about what our capability is. Those are part of a whole of government effort where the Air Force is tasked to provide certain capabilities. But the United States Air Force has also provided a continuous bomber presence in the Pacific to extend America's deterrent capability and demonstrate our global power wherever it needs to be. And by doing that, I think we've helped to keep the peace and provide stability and enable freedom and commerce in the Pacific. And so we make no apology at all for that.
If I could follow up real quickly, Madam. Of course, the bomber presence, for example, is one of the things that historically the North Koreans have objected to. And I'm wondering whether, as negotiations unfold, whether you would be concerned that this would be one thing that could be reduced or negotiated away, the Air Force bomber presence in that region.
Well, of course, the primary bomber presence that we've been rotating forward has been through Guam, and it is not specifically related to Korea. It's related to the entire Indo-Pacific region. One of the things that the National Defense Strategy recognizes is that we are now in an era of reemerging great power competition. We have a potential adversary in China that is modernizing very rapidly and is engaging with its neighbors in ways that its neighbors find threatening. One of the things that's also fascinating to me, I think for the first time in my memory anyway, we have a major line of effort in the National Defense Strategy that focuses on our allies and partners. The thing that people don't talk about quite as much, I think, as they should, is that the United States actually has allies. We have countries around the world that feel safer because they are allied with the United States of America. And our adversaries really don't. Our adversaries are threatening their neighbors. They're not cooperating with their neighbors. And it's the United States that stands for free and open navigation around the seas and peace and prosperity that benefits not just the United States, but benefits other countries as well.
I wanted to actually ask you about military housing. We had a congressional hearing last week. It's obviously been a topic of conversation in the military and in Washington recently. Army Secretary Esper apologized recently for the condition of some Army housing. What are you seeing on the Air Force side? Are you happy with the conditions? Does it match sort of the narrative that we've seen over the recent days? Or are you in better condition?
Well, we do know we have some privatized housing contractors who have not met expectations, and we deal with that base by base. We also know that one of the things that bothered me, Dan, last week about the hearing was not so much that there are issues in housing. Housing is generally better than it was in the 1990s when we went to privatization. I think that's pretty well accepted. But that on bases, even where we've had significant problems, we've got some major construction and rework underway where there were construction deficiencies. But airmen who are in housing have a right to expect prompt and competent maintenance of housing that they're in. And I think there have been some identified issues with that. The thing that really bothered me about last week was there were a couple of families who said that they were afraid of retaliation if they reported a housing problem to their landlord. That their landlord would tell their commander, tell their boss that they were being difficult or something. That really bothered me, and that's a leadership issue. As a result, the Chief of Staff and I have directed 100% review by leadership, by the base and wing commanders of housing units for the United States Air Force. So 100% review, let's get eyes on. There's nothing better than leadership's eyes on to see if there's a problem. And we are also we've asked our Inspector General to look at our processes for managing housing to see if there are some systemic changes that we need to make.
We're now at the halfway point.
Were there any specific bases or installations that drew your concern on the Air Force side?
We know we have 4 bases where we've had construction deficiencies in the privatized housing. Tinker, MacDill, and there were 2 others, and I'm going to blank on them as I'm sitting here. But for example, at Tinker, in the privatized housing when it was built, there was a construction deficiency in the subcontracting for the piping. So there was just a lawsuit settled on it, and they are tearing apart the houses and redoing all of the plumbing in the privatized housing. At McDill, it was the ceiling wasn't done right on the ventilation and air conditioning system, so they're having to seal all of those things. So we know we have 4 bases where there are significant problems in construction, so there were construction deficiencies. We already have contracts underway that'll complete within the next 8 to 18 months, depending on the base. Now, so we've got 4 bases where we know that's an issue. We also have some other bases where things are going pretty well. Often it comes down to local leadership and making sure that if there is a problem, that it is elevated and addressed between the companies and the Air Force.
While we're talking about personnel, you've also recently announced a deploy or get out policy. Can you explain to our audience what the thinking is behind that and what you expect it to do to the forces?
Sure. A little less than a year ago, the Department of Defense gave a new Department of Defense instruction on deployability. And what we released last week was how the Air Force will implement that new policy. And it's basically, if you have been non-deployable for over a year, you have to be referred for a review to say, all right, is this something that continues to be temporary? What's the plan for getting you back to deployable status? There are some cases where somebody's in a field that doesn't deploy at all, and the fact that they are prevented from taking, anti-malaria drugs or something for some medical condition doesn't matter to us. As an example, if you're an intercontinental ballistic missile operator, we really don't care if you can deploy, because you're always going to be in an ICBM silo in the upper Midwest. So it's just not an issue for some of our airmen. And so we'll deal with those on a case-by-case basis. When
you've done the analysis, how many people do you expect to be impacted by this?
Well, right now, I think it's about 93 or 94% of our force is deployable at any one time. We're trying actually to get to about 95%, so we're very close to where we think we need to be. On any month, you have a certain number of people who are temporarily non-deployable. If you twist your ankle, you're on crutches, you're not deployable for 3 weeks. So you always have that. And the real key for us is medical readiness, making sure that if somebody is non-deployable because they don't have their dental appointment up to date or they haven't gotten their shots done, get into the doc, get that taken care of, because we want to be ready. And we are an expeditionary Air Force, and we need to be ready to deploy.
Madam Secretary, you mentioned ICBMs, and with the Democrats having taken control of the House, now one of the issues that has risen to the top, toward the top in the House Armed Services Committee is the future of the U.S. nuclear weapons policy. And the question that has been raised by Congressman Smith as the new chairman is the future or the future of the modernization program, as well as the question of whether all 3 legs of the triad are really necessary. Of course, that affects the Air Force in 2 ways, and I'm wondering whether you can explain your position on why both the bombers and the ICBM force are necessary.
Yeah. The nuclear deterrent has helped to keep the peace for over 70 years, and the nuclear deterrent has been revalidated and supported by every president and every Congress since Harry Truman was in the White House. And that was true. President Obama came into his administration asking those same kind of questions, and it ended up revalidating the importance of the triad. So the triad includes submarines, bombers, and the ground-based nuclear deterrent, which is the intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Air Force has 2 of those legs of the triad. We operate the bombers and we operate the ICBMs. We also have 3/4 of nuclear command, control, and communication. All of the legs of the triad need to be modernized. The ICBMs were first deployed in the 1970s. The bombers, of course, we are in the midst of buying a new bomber, the B-21, which will be nuclear capable, and we're replacing the air-launched cruise missile. Things wear out and get old, the materials get old, and they need to be replaced. But the nuclear posture review that recently was done in the Defense Department and President Obama's nuclear posture review supported the triad as well as a strong nuclear command control and communications network.
May I?
Sure.
Sorry. As a follow-up, your immediate predecessor had to deal with morale issues in the ICBM force that were related in many ways to resources and the question of how much money was being spent on modernization. Things have evolved since then to some degree, but I'm wondering whether you have delved into that question and are satisfied that that force is stable and on the right track.
I've been to our ICBM bases as well as our bomber bases. Haven't yet been out to Malmstrom, but I have been to both Minot and to F.E. Warren in Wyoming. I would say that the changes that were made by my predecessor have helped tremendously, but I will also say this, the Air Force as a whole has been stretched. We are too small for what the nation has been asking us to do, which is why the Chief of Staff and I, with the support of the President and the Congress, have been trying to restore the life and health of our squadrons and trying to increase the end strength and put support back in the squadrons so that if life in the squadron is good, the morale of the Air Force and the combat power of the Air Force is in its squadrons. The squadrons are the beating heart of the Air Force. And in the wake of sequester, a lot of support was taken away from squadrons, and we are trying to put that back in so that the warfighters there can focus on the mission.
5 minutes, gentlemen.
One thing in the budget request that I think a lot of people will be watching for is where the F-15X conversation goes, whether or not to go buy more fourth generation fighters or whether or not to focus more heavily on the F-35. We're very close to that budget request now. Can you lay out where the Air Force stands and what you expect to see?
Yeah, the Air Force is strongly committed to the F-35, which is our stealth next generation fighter, and it's not just because it's a game changer. I just came back from visiting Nellis and our red flag exercise, and just as one vignette as to why this capability matters, it's the quarterback in the fight. So it's the only aircraft that we have that can call the shots inside contested airspace. And just one little vignette. New young fighter pilot right out of training. This is his 7th or 8th sortie in the aircraft. So he's brand new. Goes up to fight at Nellis, and he's up against a 3,000-hour fighter pilot in a 4th generation aircraft. Comes up on the radio and says, "Turn around, you're dead. I'm right in front of you." And then within the next hour went on to shoot down, or virtually shoot down, 3 other aircraft. This is a game-changer aircraft, and we're committed to it. The question overall is we've got to get larger in the number of fighter units we have to meet the threat in the 2025-2030 timeframe. And we have some older aircraft, like the F-15C, that are far beyond their expected service life. So how can we get to a point where we're buying about 72 fighters a year, and what should that mix be? One of the things that we have considered and that will be coming over to the Congress in the budget is the possibility of replacing those F-15C, very old aircraft, with an F-15EX, which is a much more modernized 4th generation platform. And it's because we're budget limited. Can we get more capability and get more aircraft, buy more aircraft if we buy some 4th gen and the rest F-35s?
Do you intend or expect to be buying any of the new F-15s at this point?
I expect that that's the proposal that will go forward. And one of the other things, Dan, that this does is we have some allies that have put a lot of research and development into the F-15. We know that the F-15C, we can't extend its life much longer, and we certainly don't want to get to the point where we have 54 fighter squadrons now. Our analysis says we need 62. We don't want to be having to ground aircraft and reduce the number of squadrons that we have when we actually need to be going in the other direction. The Qataris and the Saudis have put some research and development into the F-15, so we may be able to leverage off the money they've spent and buy off the end of the line, replace those old F-15Cs with newer F-15EXs.
We have 2 minutes left. Some final questions from you?
Madam Secretary, a quick question about Afghanistan. As General Miller, the commander there, has mentioned that he is making some what he calls efficiency moves to, in effect, reduce the size of the U.S. force there. I'm wondering to the degree to which this has affected or will affect the Air Force role.
Well, as you know, we organize, train, and equip forces, and it's the combatant commander that tells us what kinds of forces that he needs, and we then send them over. But with respect to Afghanistan particularly, the Air Force has been very heavily involved in Afghanistan over the last year. And it's one of the things that to me is very different. It really changed in my decade or more away from the military is precision intelligence combined with very effective air power has really helped both in Afghanistan and in the fight against ISIS. We'll respond to the combatant commander requirements and provide the forces that he needs.
Dan, do you have a final question? We have a minute left.
Yes, thank you. I guess with as much time as we have, what's the current status of Tyndall Air Force Base following the hurricane? What sort of initial steps have you been able to make?
Yeah, Tyndall got hammered by the hurricane. We have moved some of our money around within our budget to try to do the initial recovery. We have some operations that are back there, but we will need supplemental support from the Congress to recover that base. And we think we do need to recover that base because it is right next to the Gulf Training and Test Range. It's a tremendous place to do training. What we have proposed to the Congress to do is, rather than rebuild it the way it was, is to rebuild it as our next F-35 base. So we would have to change infrastructure at other bases. In this case, we know we've got to replace a lot of infrastructure. Let's replace it and make it a fifth-generation base.
Because the public's been hearing so much about this with the President's emergency declaration for the border wall, will any of Air Force funds be tapped?
We have not gotten any information on that at this point.
And that does it for our time. It's a very big week for the Air Force with the Space Force announcement and also the upcoming North Korean summit. We very much appreciate you being on C-SPAN's Newsmakers.
Thank you.
So, gentlemen, let's start with the Space Force. What is the reception going to be in the Congress? Let's start with the House of Representatives because it's got both a policy component and then a funding component. So on the policy side, the new Democratic head of the Armed Services Committee has a big Air Force base in his district. What will the reception be by the Armed Services Committee and then also by the appropriators for this?
I look at this with great interest and a lot of question marks at this point. The House was, to a degree, able to push through a Space Corps proposal prior to the President really weighing in on this. But that was at a different time when we didn't have a Democratic majority. And I think the political landscape there has shifted enough where it becomes a lot more of a question.
I would say one thing that might work in the favor of this proposal is the fact that they seem to have pared it down financially to a relatively smaller amount of investment than may have been feasible at the beginning or expected at the beginning.
It seems like if it goes forward, there'll be a lot of R&D money. I mean, that's the whole idea, is to develop a new way of approaching our adversaries. Is there also a review in the Pentagon about R&D and procurement and whether or not there's a better way to go about it than has been done in the past? So are we expecting new approaches to this with all the R&D that will be necessary?
There has been broad agreement within the military and within sort of the political leadership that more money needs to be spent on space and that they need to maintain their advantage. How they do that is, I think, more the friction point at this point. One thing that I think stood out loud and clear here is by not initially proposing now moving toward a full space department with a new service secretary. They've probably maybe bought themselves some time to work on those other things like that, where there is agreement, and the rest would be, maybe a second-term administration thing, or perhaps never happen.
For those that are opposed to the idea, the Secretary makes the case about Russia, China having great interests in space, and that we need really to up our game. So what would be the people who are opposed to this? What are their counter-arguments?
Well, I think one of them is the talk of an arms race in space. If, in fact, creation of a space force leads to development and deployment of weapons in space, perhaps either as part of a missile defense system that is connected really to space because it actually uses space, or whether it's simply anti-satellite weapons or defensive weapons. I think the concern is that this would lead to competition that would take China and Russia's, the competition with China and Russia to a new level.
Yeah, more to add.
No, I think that's a very good point. Even in the president's announcement, within this last week, he sort of teased it a bit of, like, well, this is mostly defensive, but he mentioned the word offensive, and a lot of people in the Pentagon cringe when he does that because they like to cast the Space Force or Space Corps, or whatever it would have been over the last handful of years, as strictly a sort of a defensive program.
Yeah, and he said, let's admit it, or let's say it,
Exactly.
offensive as well. We have about 2 minutes left. Let me move on to the North Korean summit, and not just the Air Force, but the Pentagon as a whole. What are they looking for from the president this week as he reapproaches the North Korean leader? Bob?
Well, I would say one point is I think there's a concern that, as happened last time, they were surprised immediately after the summit where the president said that they were canceling exercises, a major exercise, which is, in the view of most in the Pentagon, a necessary thing to keep the North Koreans at bay, so to speak. It's a necessary part of the overall strategy, and they wonder this time whether that or something else will be added to the mix, that the president will put something on the table that will have some ramifications for the long-term U.S. role there and the alliance with South Korea.
Within the military lane, one issue that came up, and it was sort of an initial win with the last summit, was the repatriation of American remains, and that there are still thousands of remains north of the border in North Korea, especially. A lot of those were aircraft crashes, and we haven't seen a lot of public movement since then. There have been at least no acknowledged, exercises to bring remains home, any kind of joint patrols or anything like that, where you would actually go into North Korea on the ground and start looking. Whether or not there's any kind of movement on that, I think there will be a lot of military families watching.
I have about 30 seconds left. In our questioning, you touched on 4 major issues that impact rank and file. Things like base housing, things like morale in the ICBM Corps, and other issues, the deployability status. What is your reporting telling you about the overall morale within the Air Force at this point? Dan?
It's mixed. There is certainly excitement over there being additional money to fly, that there's more money to get up in the aircraft, that there are more pilots willing to stay as a result of those sorts of things. But there's confusion based on the mixed messages they get from the very top. And I think there are some people that are more inclined to stay and others that are more inclined to leave.
Bob?
I think the big point that Dan makes is resources. If they see that more resources are being made available, I think that makes them pleased that they have a future in the force, and that tends to boost morale.
Squadron health, as the
Yes.
Secretary said.
Yes.
Well, thanks to both of you for your good questions this week for the Secretary. Nice to have you back on the program.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.